I'm very pleased now to welcome my next guest and a very good friend of the Hill, Senator Roy Blunt from Missouri. We were talking about him earlier in today's program. He's the ranking member on the Appropriations Subcommittee that oversees budgeting for the Department of Health and Human Services during his time in Congress. Senator Blunt has championed Alzheimer's research and innovation in big ways, as we were just discussing. Senator Roy, it's great to see you as always. We were talking to Maria Carrillo earlier, the Chief Science Officer of the Alzheimer's Association, who said you're the one who delivered basically the level of funding that has changed the game in Alzheimer's. Over $3 billion a year now, raising it during your tenure from $600 million. That's a quintupling of resources in this space. Tell us what next on your agenda on the Alzheimer's front.
Well, Steve, great to be with you and great to follow Mark Wayne. He and I did something just a few months ago on mental health, another thing the president mentioned last night, and another thing that I've spent a lot of time on, and so has Mark Wayne Mullins. And so glad to be here with you, glad to be following him in this discussion. You know, when I did become the chair of that committee half a dozen years ago, NIH research hadn't had any real increase actually no increase in about a dozen years. And we've been able to increase the budget of NIH research by 43%. But the huge increase of the individual categories, the biggest increase of all was in Alzheimer's. It's the disease that more and more people dread having. You know, for years there's been a poll question, what disease do you fear the most? And that's always been cancer since the question was being asked, but Alzheimer's is right up there with cancer. The two previous guests both had personal experiences with this, and this is one of those diseases that impact families in ways that are just unanticipated and overwhelming. And so more and more people see the impact of this disease, know the importance of finding a way forward, and I hope we can do that, and I hope it does become the kind of priority that you just talked about as one of the things that ARPA-H, as I believe the president envisions it, would be able to focus on an immediate challenge with a thought that we've finally got a place here that we can move forward. Let's put all our effort behind that, unlike the normal NIH grant, more like the defense research grants that we've done as partnerships, frankly, in some ways more like warp speed in vaccines, or the testing things we did with what Senator Lamar Alexander and I called the Shark Tank, where once you got through the Shark Tank with your idea, the Shark Tank team actually became part of your team on an ongoing basis in a way that really produced incredible results in a short period of time. So there's no question that Alzheimer's is becoming more and more the part of more and more lives as people live longer, and we've got to find some way to make a difference in Alzheimer's that we haven't quite found yet.
Senator, I'm going to ask you a question, and I don't know if I'm going to get it out right, but I had this really fascinating conversation yesterday with a guy about sanctions, and he said, Steve, sanctions, you know, don't always work, but he says, you know, this guy who in Democratic and Republican administrations, you know, brought down John Gotti, brought down global crime cartels, brought down and influenced various bad governments in the world. And he says, you know, it's a war. Sanctions is a kind of war, and sometimes you're able to do things with a specificity of attack that makes a difference, and other times talking bland sanctions gets you nowhere. You know, you just scuff them off. But it just made me think this is a similar discussion, and you have insights rather than throwing a big blob of money at something. You just talked about Shark Tank. You just talked about a DARPA-like approach. What are some of those things? And in the war with Alzheimer's, and I think it is a war to some degree, increases the efficaciousness from your perspective of how we can look at results down the road in improving the advancement of science, partnerships with corporations. You've been at this a long time. I'd just love to get your insights on what would be the right structural enhancements that we should make from a policy perspective.
Well, I think we made significant progress. Some of it is eliminating what we now believe won't work with the traditional NIH. Here's a grant, you're going to periodically report, you've got often a 5-year structure to deal with. and that's very traditional, but looking for specific ways that seem to have promise in terms of how do you slow this down. In many cases, this is an aging disease. If you can slow it down enough, it doesn't become a problem because other things overcome your system, and this never quite gets there. Dr. Randy Bateman at Washington University, where they've had the Diane studies and other things on Alzheimer's for a long time, Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, he and a group of his fellow colleagues there have come up with a blood test that they believe is going to have impact in narrowing down who should take the more defined test. I think that blood test is somewhere in the neighborhood of 90% of the time they can determine whether you're someone who should have the more expensive, more intricate scan. And if you find out early enough that you've got this problem developing, I think there may be some things that we've already decided don't reverse the impact of Alzheimer's or dementia, but in looking at this in another way, might dramatically slow down that impact. And so whether it's a blood test or an eye scan is another thing that other researchers have looked at. If you could figure out ways to, in a mass testing kind of way that was not expensive, not intrusive, not too difficult, could determine that in all likelihood, no, you're not going to have this problem. So we don't need to have the brain scan, which is now one of the few ways you can look at and see if the amyloid buildup is there or the other things that the cognitive problems with Alzheimer's. And you mentioned a war. Let me say one other thing about that. The current cost, Steve, of Alzheimer's economically is about 1/2 of the defense budget.
Wow.
Wow. These numbers get big and you don't know how do you put them in context, but 1/2 of every plane, every ship, every military base, every military payroll, every uniform, every trading dollar all over the world for the United States, 1/2 of that now is being spent on Alzheimer's with either direct government help or the other costs that aren't usually covered by insurance or anything else. And the projection is that by 2060 or so, we could have a disease that the total cost of that disease is equal the defense budget of the United States of Missouri. And so the United States of America. And so when you think about the broad expansion of that, you're suddenly beginning to see the economic cost. And then you just had two guests on that talked about the dramatic emotional cost to families involved. This is a disease where it seemed to me, looking at it for some time now, that the caregivers, the people that care about somebody with Alzheimer's, in many ways are more impacted by the disease than the person who has Alzheimer's.
Given the scale and the impact on families' lives, America, you just talked about the costs and burden. Do you think it's not time for a White House, this White House, President Biden's White House, to consider doing what we're trying to do today, bring different corners of the debate together and have a White House conference focused on beating Alzheimer's?
Well, whether it's a White House conference or not, I don't know the right kind of focus, but I do know in the discussions I've been with the White House on the whole concept of ARPA-H, the president and many others, for his own family and personal history, always begins to look at cancer as one of the topics. But I think they're also looking and understanding that what we just talked about, that Alzheimer's has to be one of the things that we do our best to make a difference on. We've made a huge difference already on cancer with immunotherapy and other things that weren't part of the treatment regimen for cancer just a handful of years ago. That are now one of the go-to treatments for many of the cancers people have, where your own system figures out with some help, some restructuring, how to fight back. So we're making progress there. There's more progress we need to make. But there are other things that also ought to be in the line of consideration. And if you're looking at a defense research agency kind of view, I think you really need to be looking for that moment that we need to move outside the normal confines of expedited research and go to a further commitment to find this, if this one thing works or not, and if it does, how do we quickly deploy it to try to get on the other side of this uphill battle we've been fighting with Alzheimer's for a long time now. But the older the population gets, the more people are going to be affected by these aging diseases. And we don't want to suggest getting older is a bad thing. What we do want to suggest is let's see what we can do to identify and slow down, if not eliminate if possible, but slow down this tendency that people have as they age to have these dementia types of issues become part of their daily life, and maybe more importantly, in many ways, the daily life of everybody who cares about them.
Really quick, Roy, somebody just sent me your resume. I guess word is out. You're looking for a new job. Going to get this, and we're happy to consider doing an interview. But I guess my big question is, beside the interview we'll do set up later, are your colleagues going to be the heroes you've been as they succeed you once you leave the Senate, maintain the priority that you have on Alzheimer's?
Well, I hope so. And, we're looking, one of the things I'm doing in this last year in the Senate is looking for people to step up in areas like NIH research and Alzheimer's specifically, and Special Olympics and other things, Pell Grants, other things that I feel like I've been one of the principal advocates for, to be sure that we continue to have that person there that's filling that advocacy role and getting others to join them. And I'm confident that will happen, but it won't happen all by itself.
Well, I love my conversations with you, and I'm going to continue them with you whether you're in the Senate or not. But Senator Roy Blunt from Missouri, thank you so much for joining us as always.
It's good to know I'll have somebody to talk to when I'm done working. So thank you a lot.
Thank you.